The wind off the Missouri came cold that spring, dragging the scent of thawed mud and tallow through the picketed walls of Fort Union. Wagons from the wintering camps creaked into the yard, wheels groaning beneath packs of beaver, otter, and mink. French, Mandan, Crow, and half a dozen tongues more wove through the air until it was less a fort than a living market, a place where words were traded as freely as pelts. Charles Larpenteur, the clerk, sat behind the long counter in the main storehouse, tallying bundles and marking each with his neat initials. He noted, as always, the old trader named Elias Carter, whose hair was the gray of wet ash, and whose eyes held that fixed, far-seeing light of men who had crossed too many ranges to count. Carter had come in from the Powder River country with a small lot of fine Taos pelts, mink mostly, wrapped in buffalo hide and stitched with yucca twine. He claimed they'd come to him by trade from a party of Mexican trappers bound north from the Sangre de Cristo. The goods looked sound enough, though the leather wrapping was stiff with age. When Larpenteur cut the cords and began unrolling the bundle, something dry and brittle slipped out and fluttered to the dirt floor. It was a scrap of parchment, cracked and yellowed, no larger than a man's hand. The ink, brown as dried blood, traced a handful of crooked lines, a river, perhaps, or a mountain chain, and near one edge, the faint outline of a sunburst marked with a cross. Carter bent to retrieve it, brushing the dust away with the back of his fingers. At the bottom, half faded, were words in Spanish script, Las Minas Perdidas. Larpenteur laughed softly. A trader's superstition, maybe. They tell of lost mines in every range from here to the coast. But Carter did not smile. Some tales begin that way, he said, holding the fragment up to the lamplight. The parchment was stiff, but the ink had bitten deep. Whoever drew it had believed in it enough to spend. Precious iron gall on rough skin. That night, in the narrow room he rented beside the powder magazine, Carter spread the fragment across his ledger and began to compare its markings with what he remembered of other maps. He had traveled with Jedediah Smith a decade earlier, before the desert took him, and had copied parts of Smith's 1826 journal when it passed through the rendezvous camps. Smith's notations of the Great Basin arid, ringed by unknown mountains, matched in a crooked way the arch drawn on the Spanish scrap. If the fragment were true, the mines lay somewhere west of that salt wilderness, beyond rivers unnamed. Outside, the night deepened. Coyotes howled along the timbered banks, their cries thin against the wind. Inside, Carter's candle burned low, the wax guttering over pages of inked comparison. He traced the sunburst symbol again and again, wondering whether the mark meant east of the sun, as some Spanish cartographers favored, or the place where the sun meets the mountain. The next morning he carried the parchment to the trade room, where half a dozen men warmed themselves by a fire of cottonwood logs. "Tell me," he said to a Taos trapper named Romero, "you ever hear of Las Minas Perdidas?" Romero shrugged. "Every boy south of Santa Fe hears that name before he can ride. Old Coronado lost men looking for gold. Some say it was north, some say west. A few believe it lies where no Spanish man ever came back." "Would any of them mark it with a sun and cross?" Carter asked. Romero spat into the ashes. "Only if they meant it as a warning." Laughter followed, the kind that hides unease. To most of the traders, the mountains beyond the Bighorn were blank, empty spaces between hunger and frostbite. Gold, if it existed there, would never be worth the finding. Yet Carter could not shake the feeling that the parchment was more than fancy. Later that week, during the great spring rendezvous, he watched the yard, fill with hundreds of men brigades from the Missouri, freighters from St. Louis, voyageurs from the Assiniboine country. Amid the chaos of trade kegs of powder, ribbons, kettles, and whiskey, he found Larpenteur again and asked permission to copy the fort's route charts. Larpenteur, amused, granted it. Carter sat beneath the awning of the storehouse, tracing rivers and tributaries with a quill, the Spanish scrap laid beside him. Each line he drew seemed to invite another memory, a canyon glimpsed beyond the Green River, a tale told by a Crow elder of red rock that bled under the hammer. The more he compared, the clearer the connection became. The fragment's river bent southward at a precise angle, just as Smith had recorded the Humboldt's turn. Another mark, shaped like a broken star, matched the volcanic ridges near the Great Salt Lake's southern rim. By dusk, the trader's eyes burned from squinting. He poured himself a tin cup of watered whiskey and leaned back, staring at the sky above the palisade. The sunset flared copper and violet over the plains, the same colors he had seen in the desert stone years ago. Perhaps, he thought, the Spaniards had found something once, then lost it to the sands and the forgetting. Perhaps the cross on the map was not a warning, but a grave. That night he wrote in his journal, "The mark upon the hide may be truth or madness, but I feel a stirring in it, a likeness to Smith's own hand, though written by strangers." Men laugh at maps drawn before the land was known, yet every road begins in ignorance. The following days brought a restlessness he could not name. He found himself studying every Mexican trapper who entered the yard, searching for some echo of the parchment's origin. One old man, gray as the pelts on his back, claimed he had once seen such markings in a church ledger at Taos, said to have been copied from the records of Coronado's friars. Another swore the mines lay near a river that ran through stone-like glass. None agreed on the place, yet all spoke with that strange reverence men reserve for half-remembered truths. When the river ice broke and the keelboats began to load for the downriver trade, Carter stood on the bluff above Fort Union, the map fragment folded inside his coat. Below him, the fort swarmed with life packs stacked like ramparts, oxen groaning under harness, the smell of tar, grease, and animal musk thick in the warming air. He had spent 20 years trading among tribes, trapping along the Yellowstone, hauling freight for the American Fur Company. He had seen fortunes made and lost by the ounce. But never had a piece of hide set his mind alight the way this one had. He thought of Jedediah Smith again, of the man's hunger for geography, for the hidden order of land and sky. Smith had carried his maps rolled in oilskin, believing that to trace a river was to tame it. Carter, less a scholar, felt only the ache of unfinished direction. Behind him, Larpenteur called out from the yard, "You heading east this season, Carter? There's talk of new contracts out of Independence." Carter turned, the wind tugging at his coat. "No. I reckon I've one more trail to follow before I trade for paper and pen." He left Fort Union a week later, bound south with a small brigade of mixed bloods and one Crow guide who spoke of mountains that breathed smoke in winter. He carried little his rifle, traps, a pair of horses, and the folded parchment sealed inside a powder tin. In the last entry before his departure, he wrote, "There are men who say maps lie, that they tempt a fool beyond reason. Yet the land itself is a map written in stone and hunger. I will follow where it leads, though it lead me into dust." The Missouri shimmered in morning light as his canoe slipped into the current. Behind him, the walls of Fort Union shrank against the horizon until they were only a pale line on the prairie. Ahead lay the unknown rivers, unnamed, ridges uncharted, and somewhere, perhaps, the ghost of a Spanish dream buried beneath the mountain sun. Elias Carter rode south with the dawn wind biting at his coat, the river glinting behind him like a memory he was already trying to forget. His horse's hooves sank into the thawing earth, sending up clods of black mud that clung to the fetlocks. Ahead lay the open prairie, no fences, no mile markers, only the wide breadth of the land and the faint, wavering trace of a trail that men had followed since the Mandan called this country home. He was not alone. 2 other men had chosen to ride with him, though neither for gold nor glory. The first was Etienne Marchand, a French Creole interpreter with the careless grace of a gambler and the teeth of a man who'd bitten more lead balls than bread. The second was a Crow scout called Two-Elk, quiet and compact, whose eyes never lingered where they looked. Between them they carried traps, powder, a few provisions, and Carter's obsession sealed inside a tin case his Spanish fragment. For the first week they rode along the Milk River, moving through a plain that shimmered with new grass. Bands of elk drifted along the ridges, their hides dull from winter. At night the men built small fires and spoke in low tones. Marchand cursed the mosquitoes and asked again about the map. Carter only said, "It points west. That's enough." Two-Elk said little, but one evening he drew in the dust with a stick, a rough outline of peaks shaped like a horned skull. "The mountains of smoke," he said in halting English. "White men come there long ago. They dig the ground, then leave bones." Carter felt the skin along his neck tighten. He asked, "You saw them?" The crow shook his head. "Old ones saw. My grandfather say they dig for red stone, not yellow, red like blood when it sleeps." Marchand laughed and tossed a pine cone into the fire. "Every people's got their ghosts, mon ami. Yours just happened to carry shovels." But Carter made note of it. He was learning that every rumor carried a grain of truth if a man sifted long enough. They crossed the Powder River country in mid-May, where the prairie broke into hills and the grass thinned into sage. The wind came harder there, dry as flour, and the sun flayed the skin off their hands. At night, the frost still came, creeping through the seams of their blankets. More than once, they awoke to find their coffee frozen in the pot. Once, as they climbed a ridge above a coulee, Carter stopped and stared west. The horizon rippled under the heat, but beyond it he thought he could see the first faint ghosts of mountains. For hours afterward he rode in silence, hearing only the squeak of his saddle and the mutter of Two Elk's pony. That night he unrolled his tin case beside the fire and spread the parchment on his knee. The edges had begun to curl from the damp, but the ink still showed the same broken lines, the same sunburst. Marchand leaned over and squinted. "You know, Elias," he said, "that mark could be anything. A priest's blessing, maybe. Or just a doodle." Carter didn't look up. "Maybe, but it matches Smith's map where the desert gives way to high country. Same curve in the river, same notch in the ridgeline. Too close for chance." Marchand shrugged. "Then we ride for ghosts and geography. Either way, I get paid in beaver." Two Elk watched from across the fire, his face carved in red shadow. "The land remembers men like you," he said softly. Not always kindly. By June they had reached the Bighorn foothills. The rivers ran high and violent with snowmelt. Twice they nearly lost their horses in the crossings. The second time the current tore Marchand's pack loose and sent it spinning downstream. They found it an hour later tangled in driftwood, the leather shredded and the contents gone. That night Marchand cursed the river gods and talked of turning back. Carter said nothing, only stirred the coals with a stick. Two Elk stared into the fire and murmured something in Crow that sounded like a prayer. In his journal that night Carter wrote, "The river takes as it pleases. Yet there is a pattern to the losing. What it claims from one hand, it shows in another." The mountains grow nearer, blue teeth against the sky. When they reached the base of the Wind River Range, the air grew thin and cold. The scent of pine replaced the endless grass, and the wind spoke through the trees like an instrument. Snow still clung to the shaded gullies, though the meadows bloomed with yellow buttercups. Here, at last, the map began to make sense. The bend of the range followed the curve inked on the fragment. The valley below mirrored the faded lines near its edge. Carter felt the pulse of discovery quicken in his chest. For 20 years he had traded for other men's fortunes. Now he chased his own. They found an old camp near a spring, a ring of stones, blackened with soot. Within the ashes lay rusted fragments of iron and what looked like the lip of a crucible. Carter lifted it, rubbed away the dirt, and saw the unmistakable glaze of melted ore. "Spanish," he whispered. "By God, they were here." Marchand frowned. "Could be French, could be Indian, could be last year." Carter shook his head. "Look at the slag. It's old, older than the forts, older than the trade. They smelted something here." Two Elk's gaze was steady. "This is bad ground. My people do not stay. Because of spirits. Because of memory," the Crow said. "Men who dig for what sleeps in the earth always wake it." Carter folded the fragment and tucked it back into its tin. He looked toward the mountains, rising above the valley snow peaks, touched with the last light of day, and felt both awe and fear. The map was no longer a rumor, it was a trail. And now that he had found the first sign, there was no turning back. That night the wind came hard down the range, scattering sparks from their fire. Carter sat awake long after the others slept, the tin case resting beside his knee. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay the truth of Las Minas Perdidas, and, perhaps, the price of finding it. The mountains rose like frozen waves against the western sky. Stone and snow fused into a silence so deep that every hoofbeat seemed an intrusion. Elias Carter led his horse along a narrow pass where the wind scraped the rock like a whetted knife. Below, in the shadow of the ridge, smoke drifted from the valley floor, faint and twisting, as though the earth itself exhaled. By then, the map fragment had become more than a curiosity. It was a magnet pulling at every mile of Carter's endurance. Etienne Marchand followed out of loyalty or folly. Carter couldn't tell which, and 2 elk rode behind, his eyes scanning the cliffs with the wary patience of one who knew how quickly land could turn on a man. They camped near a stream that smelled of metal, its stones stained red and orange. Carter knelt, dipped his hand in the water, and tasted it. The flavor was bitter, almost acrid. "Iron," he said softly. "Maybe copper." 2 elk shook his head. "Fire under the ground," he pointed to the colored stones. "The old ones call this place where the sun burns inside." The next morning, while mist still clung to the valley, they followed the stream to its source. There, half buried in talus, lay a pit lined with blackened rock. Near it were chunks of slag, glassy, heavy, unnatural. Marchand picked up one piece and turned it over in his hands. "Looks like a forge blew out here," he said, "but who'd smelt iron in a place no mule can reach?" Carter brushed away loose soil and found the rim of a stone furnace, its lip fused by heat centuries old. Beside it, fragments of crucibles and a rusted iron rod lay scattered in the dust. The discovery hit him like a blow. "They found it," he murmured. "The Spaniards, or what was left of them." He crouched and studied the rocks more closely. Embedded within the slag were veins of dull gold and glittering pyrite, indistinguishable in poor light. His pulse quickened. "Marchand," he said, "fetch the pick." The Frenchman hesitated. "We came to trap, not to dig graves. You think this hole's been waiting for you 300 years? "Maybe," Carter said, eyes still fixed on the furnace. "Or maybe it's been waiting for any fool who believes ink and legend." They worked until dusk, cutting through loose rock, uncovering a shallow shaft that ran only a dozen feet deep. Inside, the walls shimmered with flecks of mineral that danced like fire in the lamplight. Carter chipped at one vein, the metal ringing faintly against his hammer. Marchand held up the fragment. "Fool's gold," he said flatly. "Iron pyrite. All shine, no weight." Carter took the piece, rolled it in his palm, and nodded slowly. Then, maybe the Spaniards mistook it too. They saw gold where there was none, died believing the mountain had cheated them. 2 elk squatted at the edge of the pit, tracing a pattern in the dirt with one finger, a sun crossed by lines. "The same mark as your hide," he said. "This is the place." Carter looked up at the looming peaks, the red slopes scarred by frost and fire. He thought of Coronado's men, marching under banners of faith and hunger, carving crosses into stone while their water turned to dust. He imagined them finding this same furnace, feeding it with dreams until the mountain swallowed them whole. When darkness came, they built a fire near the furnace and sat in silence. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of smoke that seemed older than their own. Carter took out his journal and wrote by firelight. Evidence of smelting beyond all question. Crucibles, slag, remnants of tools. Pyrite mistaken for gold, thus the ruin of men and the birth of a myth. The land keeps its own counsel. The map has not lied, but it has mocked. Marchand read over his shoulder. "So what now? You've found your Spanish ghosts. Do we tell the traders back east they died for glitter?" Carter closed the journal. "We tell no one yet. A truth too small is worse than a lie." 2 elk rose and looked toward the ridge where moonlight touched the snowfields. "We go soon," he said. "This ground remembers fire. The spirits do not sleep when men dig." That night, a storm came down the mountains. The wind tore through the valley, snapping limbs and scattering embers. Carter dreamed of men in tarnished armor climbing out of the pit, their eyes hollow, their hands clutching gold that melted into dust. When he woke, the fire was out, and the rain hissed on the stones. At dawn, the furnace was half collapsed, the stream running muddy with silt. Carter walked to the edge of the pit and watched the water fill it, slow and deliberate, as if the mountain were sealing its wound. He turned to Marchand. "We'll move west," he said. "If there was one camp, there might be another." The Frenchman shook his head. "You won't stop till the map's eaten every mile of you." "Maybe that's what maps are for." Carter said, cinching his saddle strap. Two elk mounted silently, his gaze distant. "The sun burns inside," he murmured again. As they rode out, the valley swallowed their tracks under the morning rain. Behind them, the furnace stones steamed in the gray light, whispering to no one. Carter didn't look back. He felt no triumph, only the strange pull of unfinished revelation. If the Spaniards had perished for fool's gold, it was not the metal that mattered, but the madness that drove them to dig. He understood that now, though it did nothing to cool the fire that had already begun in his own heart. He tightened his grip on the reins, the tin case pressing against his chest like a heartbeat. The map had not lied, but neither had it told the truth. It had only pointed to the hunger men carried within them fire under the ground. By late September, the snow line had begun to creep down the mountains. The aspens turned yellow along the ridges, their leaves shivering like coins in a cold wind. Elias Carter's horses were thin and restless, their ribs showing beneath worn hides. Etienne Marchand's temper had thinned too. Every mile west seemed to lead not toward riches, but toward emptiness. They had crossed through 3 high passes, each one crueler than the last, and seen no sign of another furnace, no trace of Spanish digging, only the endless scars of wind and stone. Yet Carter pressed onward, chasing the ghost of a pattern only he could see. 2 elk followed without complaint, though the crow's eyes grew watchful and his voice quieter with each day. When the first snowstorm hit, it came without warning, a gray curtain rolling down the peaks. Within an hour the sky vanished, and the wind began to roar through the pines like a living thing. The men tried to pitch their lean-to, but the canvas tore in the gusts. By nightfall their firewood was gone, and the snow rose past their knees. Carter knew they would die if they stayed in the open. He scanned the ridges through the blowing white until he caught sight of a dark shape, a cliff face with a hollow at its base. They fought their way toward it, leading the horses by the halters, the animals snorting clouds of steam. The hollow turned out to be a shallow cave, half blocked by drifted snow but dry inside. They dragged their gear in and collapsed. Marchand cursed through chattering teeth. "So this is where your map leads, eh? To a hole in the mountain?" Carter ignored him. The cold had reached his bones, but instinct, old, practical, and stubborn, took over. He began scraping at the cave floor with his knife, testing the earth. It was clay, smooth and dense, not the brittle sand of most mountain soil. He remembered something from his trading years among the Mandan, how they mixed clay with ash to seal their lodges against winter. "2 elk," he said. "Help me gather wood and stone." Marchand groaned. "We need fire, not mud huts." Carter's eyes flared. "We'll need both, if you want to wake alive." By torchlight they set to work. Carter mixed the clay with handfuls of pine ash from their meager fire, stirring it with meltwater in a pan. The mixture grew thick, heavy, and warm to the touch. He slapped it against the inner wall of the cave, sealing cracks where the wind whistled through. 2 elk followed his rhythm, pressing the clay into the rock with open palms, murmuring in crow. The work steadied them, gave order to the storm outside. When the wind rose again, they stacked flat stones across the mouth of the cave and plastered them with the same clay. The snow built up against it, but the wall held. The air inside grew still. By morning, the storm had passed. Carter woke to silence, a heavy, muffled quiet, broken only by the hiss of melting snow dripping from the roof. The air was warm. He pushed his hand against the clay wall. It radiated a faint heat, as if the earth itself breathed warmth through it. Marchand stirred, blinking. "It's not cold," he said, almost in disbelief. "How in God's name the clay?" Carter answered. "It holds heat, same way it holds cool when the sun beats down." 2 elk nodded, touching the wall. "The land remembers. You listen to her breath." They rebuilt the fire and watched the smoke curl upward, caught in a small vent Carter had left near the ceiling. The balance of warmth and air was near perfect. It was the first good night's sleep they'd had in weeks. In the days that followed, they improved the shelter. Carter fashioned a chimney of stone and clay, and 2 elk wove a mat of willow branches for the floor. Marchand, once skeptical, became their cook and tanner, scraping hides into bedding. The snow deepened outside, but within the clay house their breath no longer frosted the air. One evening Carter sat near the wall, tracing its surface with his fingertips. "You see," he said to Marchand, "the Spaniards built with what they knew, stone and iron. But the tribes knew something older. You trap air inside earth, and it keeps you alive." "That's worth more than any gold vein," Marchand grunted. "You sound like a priest giving thanks for the coffin." Carter smiled faintly. "A coffin keeps out the cold, too." When the weather cleared at last, they stepped outside and saw the valley glazed in white. Steam rose from their horses' nostrils. Above, the mountains shone like burnished metal under the sun. The hut behind them glowed faintly in the light, its clay surface drying to a pale, stony hue. Carter took his journal from his coat and wrote, "This lodge, born of storm and earth, keeps a man warm without fire and cool without shade. I have found in it a wisdom greater than any map. The Crow taught it by instinct, the Spaniards forgot it in pride. I shall call it my house of clay and shadow." Two Elk listened as Carter read the line aloud, then said simply, "The land teaches what the books forget." That night, as they prepared to move on, Carter placed his hand against the wall one final time. It was cool now, the storm's memory fading. He thought of the furnaces they'd found, the slag, the false gold. Men had burned whole valleys for the promise of wealth, but the real treasure, he realized, was endurance, the art of staying alive when the mountain meant to bury you. As they rode west at dawn, the hut stood behind them, half hidden by frost, its clay walls glowing faintly in the sun. It would outlast them all. Carter thought proof that survival was its own kind of alchemy. He looked back only once, then turned his horse toward the next horizon. The map, folded in his breast pocket, rustled softly as it, though whispering a new direction. When the thaw came, it came all at once. The rivers swelled and tore at their banks, carrying logs, bones, and whole drifts of winter's ruin. The mountains steamed under the sudden heat, and the valleys sang with meltwater. Elias Carter and his companions broke camp before dawn, following the current westward through a gorge that had no name on any map. The clay hut was a memory now, left behind like a chapter of some unrecorded scripture. Marchand had taken to calling it Carter's Folly, but he said it with respect now, not mockery, the respect of a man who had survived because another man refused to freeze. Two Elk spoke even less than before. The Crow's gaze drifted often toward the peaks, where the snow shone like polished bone. The fragment map had grown soft at the creases, its ink nearly gone, but Carter no longer needed it. The symbols lived behind his eyes, the curve of the sunburst, the cross near the mountain notch, the river that bent like an elbow. Each step through the canyon felt preordained, as though he were retracing someone else's memory. By noon, they reached a slope where the river narrowed into a chute of roaring white water. They followed a game trail upward until the sound of the torrent softened, and there, on a ledge half hidden by sage and rubble, Carter saw it marks carved into a boulder, weathered nearly smooth by centuries of wind. He brushed away the moss and found, faint but unmistakable, the same cross and sun symbol that marked his map. Beneath it were initials, R.M., the hand of some long-dead conquistador, perhaps one of Coronado's lost men, or one who had followed the same rumor north generations later. Marchand crouched beside him, squinting. "Looks Spanish, yes, but these rocks hold marks from every hand. Maybe a trapper, maybe a priest." Carter didn't answer. He was tracing the grooves with his thumb, feeling the depth of the chisel cuts. The stone was hard, granite, not easily marked. Whoever had carved it had worked with intent, not idle curiosity. Two Elk stood a little apart, his expression unreadable. "This place," he said quietly, "is a wound. My grandfather's people found bones here when the grass was still short, men with armor that shone like the sun. They died digging." Carter looked up sharply. "Digging for what?" Two Elk hesitated. "The mountain bleeds here. Red stones, heavy. We use them for paint. White men think it is gold." The slope above them was littered with loose rock and the stumps of dead trees. Carter climbed higher, following a faint line in the earth that might once have been a trench. The soil glittered with mica and flecks of pyrite, fooling the eye with false promise. At the top, the ground leveled into a shallow depression half filled with rubble, He knelt, pried away a flat stone, and there it was. Not treasure, not even ore, but a thin seam of mineral that gleamed dark and glassy. Obsidian. The same stone that native tribes had traded across the plains for centuries, sharper than steel when broken right. Carter exhaled, half in wonder, half in disappointment. "The lost mines," he whispered. "Not gold at all, just the mountain's teeth." Marchand laughed softly. "Then the Spaniards died for knives." "Or for what they thought knives could buy," Carter replied. He picked up a shard of obsidian, its edge keen as truth. In the sunlight it flashed with every color of the desert: black, violet, green. They saw what they wanted to see. We all do. Two elk stepped closer and pointed toward the gorge below. "They took what was not meant for them. The earth remembers." Carter nodded slowly. "Aye, but remembering is not forgiving." He spent the afternoon sketching the markings into his journal, every line, every cross, every angle of the ridge. Marchand smoked and stared at the clouds. Two elk sat in silence, eyes closed, perhaps listening, for echoes that only he could hear. When the sun began to set, Carter packed his tools and stood before the marked stone one last time. He felt no triumph, only a strange stillness, as though the mountain had been waiting for him not to find, but to understand. He said quietly, "It was never about gold." Marchand raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" "Proof," Carter said, "that stories have bones, that even the lies we inherit are built on something solid." He reached into his coat and drew out the map fragment. The inked lines looked like veins now, running toward the same heart, the same mountain. He folded it carefully, placed it inside his journal, and closed the book. That night they camped by the river, near a grove of cottonwoods. The fire crackled low, and the stars came out sharp as flint points. Carter wrote his entry by the dim glow. "The map has ended where truth begins. The marks upon the stone are old as the hunger that drew men here. The Spanish sought gold. The Crow sought meaning, and perhaps I sought both. Found neither, yet lost less than they. The earth keeps her counsel, but offers mercy to those who listen." When he finished, he closed the journal and stared into the flames until they blurred. Marchand was already asleep, his hat pulled low. Two elk sat upright, watching the night as if expecting something to emerge from it. Carter spoke softly, not sure to whom. Maybe the treasure was never under the ground. Two elk nodded once. "Now you see. The mountain gives lessons, not riches." Carter smiled faintly. "Then I reckon I'm a rich man after all." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and melted snow. The firelight flickered across their faces, and the carved stone above the gorge gleamed faintly in the starlight, half legend, half truth, as all human marks are when the earth decides to keep them. The years had turned like river stones, wearing the sharp edges off everything. Fort Union was older. Now, its timbers gray, its palisade half sunk in prairie grass. The trade had shifted south, the beaver were nearly trapped out, and the silk hats in Street Louis had long since gone out of fashion. The age of the mountain men was dying quietly, like a campfire left to smolder in rain. Elias Carter was an old man when he came riding back to the Missouri. His beard had gone white and thin, his shoulders stooped, but his eyes still held the same fierce clarity that had carried him through 100 winters. He no longer hunted gold or pelts-only memory. Behind him on a pack horse rode a small bundle wrapped in elk hide, his journal, a few tools, and a worn tin case that still held the fragment of parchment he had found so many years before. The ink had faded almost to invisibility, but he kept it close, the way a man keeps the letter of a friend long dead. He had spent the last decade living among the Crow. Two elk was gone, buried in a meadow above the Bighorn where the wind combed the grass flat every spring, but Carter had stayed with the band that had taken him in. He spoke their language now with the slow care of age, had even taken a Crow name, Makshi Hishish, man of clay walls. The name came from the lodge he had built at the edge of the valley, using the same method he and Two Elk had discovered in the storm years before. Clay mixed with ash, shaped by hand, packed thick around willow ribs. In summer, the walls breathed cool. In winter, they held the heat of a single fire. When young men came to ask how, Carter would grin through his beard and say, "It's no trick, boys, just the earth teaching you how to listen." Sometimes, when the evenings turned gold and the herds moved low across the river bottoms, he would sit by the doorway of that clay house and read from his journal. The pages had grown brittle, but the words still carried the scent of the high country, the snowmelt, the pine smoke, the bitter tang of fool's gold. He read of the Furnace Valley, of the marks beneath the stone, of the day he realized the Spaniards had not found gold but fire, and he smiled. He had gone seeking myth and come back with method. The real treasure, he understood now, was survival, the ability to shape the land's cruelty into shelter. One afternoon, a young trapper from Fort Union rode into the valley. He was barely 20, full of stories about the steamboats and the new posts springing up along the Yellowstone. "They say the army's coming west," the boy told him, "and that the fur trade's all but finished. The forts are emptying out." Carter nodded. "The land always wins in the end. Men just borrow it for a while." The boy's gaze drifted to the old man's hut. "How's it you made those walls stay up so straight? Ain't logs at all." "Clay and ash," Carter said. "Breathe through it, and the wind becomes your friend. Too tight, and you smother." The boy laughed, not quite believing, but he touched the wall and felt its warmth. "Never seen the like. Be mighty fine for a winter camp." Carter looked past him, toward the line of the mountains fading into dusk. "That's how the Spaniards should have built," he said softly. "They tried to conquer the earth with fire. They should have asked her how to live instead." When the trapper left, Carter sat alone, watching the light fade over the valley. The wind came down from the high ridges, carrying a faint scent of snow, though it was still August. It moved through the grass, through the clay seams of his house, through the hollow places in his lungs. He thought of "Two Elk," then, the quiet voice that had said the land remembers. He felt it around him now, that invisible memory that hummed through stone and water, older than any map or man. That night he wrote his last entry by the light of a tallow candle. The mines were never lost, for there were never mines, only men who mistook hunger for discovery. I have learned to build instead of dig. The crows say, "A man's soul is the shape he leaves in the world." If that be true, then mine is made of clay and shadow, warm in winter, cool in summer. Enough. When morning came, he walked to the river's edge. The mist lay thick on the water, and the cottonwoods whispered above him. He took the tin case from his pack, opened it, and held the fragment of the old Spanish map one last time. The parchment crumbled at the edges, fragile as breath. He smiled, then let it fall into the current. It floated a moment, then sank, vanishing into the silt. For a long while he stood there listening the murmur of water, the whisper of grass, the steady heart of the land itself. The wind moved through him like an old companion. It carried the scent of clay and pine smoke, and beneath it something else, a memory not his own, but the mountains. When the Crow women came at dusk to look for him, they found the door of his clay house open, the fire cold, his journal lying on the table beside a stone of obsidian polished smooth by years of turning in his hand. In the final pages, written in an unsteady but certain hand, were the words, "The wind remembers everything we forget." That winter, the Crow built their lodges near his clay house. They tended it as one tends a grave, though they did not call it that. To them it was a place where a white man had finally learned to live by the earth's rules. Years later, when soldiers and surveyors came through, they marveled at the structure. One of them, a young engineer, measured the walls, noted their temperature, and scribbled a report that would one day appear in a government archive. He called it an ingenious frontier construction, an adaptation of Indian and Spanish methods, efficient beyond expectation. But the Crow simply said, "That is where the wind sleeps warm." The steamboat far west nosed against the shallows below the mouth of the Yellowstone, its paddles slowing to a lazy churn. On the upper deck, among crates of specimens and barrels of plaster, a young surveyor named Henry Caldwell shaded his eyes against the sunlight. He had come north with a Smithsonian party cataloging remnants of the early fur trade, old forts, trading posts, and any trace of the men who had opened the West before the railroads and rifles tamed it. Caldwell had studied the reports of Charles Larpenteur. and had heard stories in the saloons of Bismarck about a mud-walled cabin somewhere in Crow country that never rotted and never froze. It was said to have been built by a trapper who'd gone half Indian, half myth. Some called him Old Clay, others the Map Man. The Smithsonian's orders were simple: find what remained and make record of it. They left the river and rode west into the foothills. The land was greening under spring rains, the cottonwoods in bud, the air thick with the hum of flies and distant thunder. After 2 days' travel, they reached a planned valley tucked between low bluffs. There, beside a curve of the river, stood the thing Caldwell had come to see. At first glance it looked like a mound of earth, slumped and irregular. But as he drew closer, the lines resolved into purpose: a square lodge, its walls smooth and clay-plastered, the roof ribbed with willows hardened by time. The door hung open. Inside, the air was dry, cool, faintly scented with ash. Against the far wall rested a rough-hewn table, and upon it a small bound book streaked with dust. Caldwell turned a page carefully. The ink had browned, but the handwriting was steady. The first line he read: "The mines were never lost, for there were never mines." He read on entries in plain, unschooled English, chronicling winters, hunger, storms, and one recurring phrase: the house of clay and shadow. There were mentions of Fort Union, of a Crow scout called Two Elk, of furnaces in the mountains, and a map that turned to dust. The handwriting faltered near the end, but one final line stood clear: "The wind remembers everything we forget." Caldwell stood for a long moment in the doorway, feeling the faint breath of cool air move through the cracks in the wall. He touched the clay and found it warm, though the morning was cold. The structure, he noted, regulated its own temperature, proof of an engineering intuition centuries ahead of its time. That evening he and his assistant, a Dakota interpreter named Samuel Ironcloud, camped near the site. As they ate by the fire, Samuel said quietly, "My grandfather told of this man, the one who built with earth, not against it. The Crow say he listened to the land until it spoke back." Caldwell nodded. If half of this journal is true, he belonged to an older age, a kind of bridge between worlds. Samuel looked toward the clay hut. "The stories say he was searching for gold but found a home instead. They call that richer." Caldwell smiled faintly. "The kind of riches Washington can't measure." He spent 2 more days cataloging the site, measuring the walls, sketching the interior. The clay showed layers: ash, soil, straw, each carefully compacted. He noted that even after nearly 40 years, the structure stood firm, the roof intact. He made a rubbing of an inscription carved into a beam near the doorway: EC 1834. When he finished, he packed the journal and a few small artifacts, a chipped obsidian blade, a crucible fragment blackened with age, and sealed them in a crate bound for the Smithsonian. Months later, in Washington, the crate was opened in a quiet office of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. Caldwell's notes accompanied the relics, and an editor wrote an article titled "The Legend of Elias Carter, Last of the Map Men." The paper drew little notice at first, but among historians of the frontier it became a small wonder, a bridge between myth and record. Scholars debated whether Carter's clay lodge was truly the first example of native-adapted architecture on the upper Missouri, or simply a happy accident of survival. Some dismissed the journal as fanciful frontier lore. Others read in it the quiet transformation of a man who had learned, as few white men did, to belong to the land rather than master it. Decades later, the story would surface again in a Smithsonian bulletin on precursor Earth architecture in the American West. The entry was brief but precise: a structure located near the Upper Yellowstone, attributed to trader Elias Carter, active 1,830 seconds, demonstrates hybrid construction methods derived from indigenous and Hispanic traditions. It remained habitable after more than 4 decades. Carter's notes, recovered in 1870, reference earlier Spanish expeditions and the myth of Las Minas Perdidas. His work bridges folklore and practical adaptation. Visitors who read the article imagined a gaunt man in buckskins kneeling beside a clay wall, pressing earth between his fingers while snow fell outside, a forgotten genius whose search for gold ended with the invention of comfort. In the spring of 1902, long after Caldwell himself was gone, a team of anthropologists revisiting the valley found only traces of the old house. The walls had slumped, the roof fallen, but the clay retained its shape in the soil, a faint square like a fingerprint pressed into the earth. The locals still called it Carter's Place. When they turned over the stones, they found fragments of obsidian and, beneath one, a flat rock carved with a shallow cross and sunburst. It matched the description from Carter's journal, the mark of Las Minas Perdidas. The lead archaeologist wrote in his report, "Whether myth or memory, the site of Elias Carter embodies the dialogue between endurance and imagination. The Spaniards dug for metal, Carter molded earth. One sought wealth beneath the ground, the other found wisdom upon it. Today, in the archives of the Museum of the Mountain Man in Flashers, Pinedale, Wyoming, Carter's journal rests under glass. The ink is barely legible, the paper browned like autumn leaves. Beside it lies a small placard, Elias Carter, D.C. 1795 1848, trader, explorer, builder of the house of clay and shadow. They said his map was a myth until it led not to gold, but to a way of living. And when the docents close the museum each evening, the wind outside moves through the sage and cottonwood, whispering along the eaves like breath against a clay wall, quiet, steady, remembering everything.